Gaming watches are the coming together of multiple different industries into one thing. These include traditional watch brands, digital watch brands, pinball and electromechanical machine producers, consumer electronic companies, computing companies and toy companies, all mixed together in a strange melting pot where they merge and overlap with one another over time. It's a really fascinating slice of watchdom, and it's the focus of today's episode of Illuminating Watches. You can go as far back as you want on the history of bar games, nod here to Gottlieb's 1931 Baffle Ball, Bagatelle and such, but I think I'll draw the line at some of the first simulations of games demonstrated in pre-transistor computers like Bertie the Brain with a game of tic-tac-toe or noughts and crosses in 1950, and the game of Nim on Ferranti's Nimrod computer shown at the 1951 Festival of Britain. As these were more demos, the nod for the first game for true entertainment purposes is normally attributed to 1958's Tennis for Two, developed by Willie Higginbotham, with the first available at-scale game passed around the various mainframe computers at universities being Space War in 1961 at MIT. Two companies we see early on are Texas Instruments and Fairchild Semiconductor, who separately developed the first integrated circuit, a fundamental requirement for digital watches, which they would both also later produce. Although they didn't produce gaming watches as far as I know, Fairchild did develop the Channel F video game console in 1976, with hockey and tennis games, and Texas Instruments had their own computer with the TI-99/4 in 1979, with great titles such as Hunt the Wumpus. So the crossover is worth mentioning. Arcades had been bustling with pinball machines as well as electromechanical arcade games by a little company called Sega with the Periscope game, with the first true video game arcade machines being Computer Space and Galaxy Game around 1971, a year before we see the first commercially available digital watch with the Pulsar time computer, dynamic scattering display digitals from Optel, and twisted pneumatic digital displays like the Gruen Teletime. Note that Gruen would later be owned by MZ Berger, who also owned a little company called Nelsonic that we'll come back to. Now, Computer Space had been designed by a couple of chaps called Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney, who in the following year would establish Atari. The launch of the first digitals in the early 1970s lines up nicely with the launch of both Atari's Pong and Magnavox's Odyssey, who had a similar game. So modern video games and digital watches were somewhat born at the same time, so it was only a matter of time until they collided. A company on the ping pong bandwagon was Japanese company Taito, the first company to produce vodka in Japan, and who released Elipong in 1973, before going on to produce the first arcade game to use an Intel processor, Gunfight, in 1975. As you'll notice is a common theme amongst these companies, Intel also had a foot in the digital watch game as they owned the brand Microma and famously made Deckard's watch in Blade Runner, the spiritual successor of which I think is probably the recent Cyberpunk 2077 watch you can see on screen. Remember that Star Wars came out in 1977, so this spacey and sci-fi aesthetic was very much in the zeitgeist. Taito, with its US partner Midway, would then light the touch paper of the golden age of the arcade with the release of Space Invaders in 1978, with aliens advancing slowly towards your shielded base that you need to pick off with your spaceship's laser without getting hit by theirs, with the occasional UFO appearance and increasingly ominous tones of impending doom. The high score element and the difficulty curve really drove it into popular culture through the arcades and the desire to beat your friends and other arcade goers. Competitor Atari would produce the 2600, often just called the Atari, in 1977, with their huge hit being a home version of Space Invaders in 1980. Contributors to Atari's game machine included Steve Jobs, but more predominantly Steve Wozniak, who made the game Breakout before moving on to develop the Apple II in 1977. Other fun overlaps between the world of computers, gaming and watches worth a mention here are Commodore, behind the Commodore 64, but also one of the driving forces behind pushing down the price of the US-based digital watch industry to the point of them being given away with food purchases in blister packs. On the British side there is Sinclair behind the ZX Spectrum, Uncle Clive with his C5 electronic tricycle, but they also made the Black Watch, an LED watch. Sinclair collaborated with Timex to launch the Timex Sinclair 1000 with titles like Fortress of Zorlak, a massive flop that got Timex out of the world of computing and back onto the digital watch bandwagon with the classic Triathlon in 1984 and later Iron Man Triathlon, which was a smash hit. A fun fact is that the Timex Dundee factory workforce in Scotland was temporarily switched over to production of Sinclair computers as this was part of the Timex collaboration, but I digress. Now there's been a couple of basic watches with a game element, the first normally considered to be Unitrex's 1977 Datatime Monte Carlo. As well, there is an LED watch from 1976 that was found by the owner owner of the Magic Digital's website that had a dice game function called Dr. Soriano. Unitrex was a brand of the Japanese company Aiko Business Machines that started out on cash registers before moving over to calculators, with them having a big push in the 70s into the US. For example, here's an advert from a US university from around the time. These calculators were made in Hong Kong, as was the Monte Carlo watch. Another example was the Meister Anker slot machine game from 1979, a brand owned by Kell, a German mail-order company, presumably acquired from a Hong Kong-based electronics company, the identity of which, from what I can tell, has faded into the ether. But the space really starts to become its own thing, with Casio in both a calculator watch game and the GM10 with a Space Invaders-style game on it, which ideally involved you turning the watch on its side, but absolutely captured some of the elements that made that game so popular. We'll come back to Casio. Similarly, a US-based company, Nelsonic Industries, founded in 1981, had been linking into Hong Kong-based electronics companies and first launched a Space Attackers game watch in 1981. Other early examples are a space shuttle game provided by Bondwell Electronics and the National Electronics and Watch Company of Hong Kong. The various Seiko sub-brands like Alba and Pulsar had a range of different game watches, and a curiosity launched in December 1982 was the Y822 voice game. Other random brands that were in this space include Konzo, Quasitron, Micronta, Cinetron, Curtis, Adec, Ventix, Omni, Trafalgar, Advance, Remex, Pyratron, and Compucron. Outside of the computer game family tree, the LED and LCD-based handheld games are another parent of these sorts of watches, with an early example being Mattel's Auto Race in 1976, and their 1977 Football, Coleco's 1978 Electronic Quarterback, Entex Industries 3D Grand Prix, with Bandai Electronics and Tomy also producing these handheld games. Another player in this field with their game Ball Toss-Up in 1980 was a company called Nintendo, who'd also released their own console in 1977, the Color TV game, and had been dabbling in video arcade games in 1979 and 1980 with Sheriff and Radar Scope. The landscape would hugely shift with the introduction of Namco's Pac-Man video arcade game in 1980, distributed by Midway in the US, which introduced the cult of personality that had been lacking with the more space-based shooting-oriented games prior, and introduced the maze chase element. Namco had been innovating with use of color with games like Galaxian, with this really coming into its own with Pac-Man, with extra character being added with the use of cutscenes and the Ghost Gang, Blinky, Pinky, Inky and Clyde, with their own behavioural characteristics built into their movements. As is well known, things went really crazy with Pac-Man and High Score Mania, with groups like Twin Galaxies and the notorious Billy Mitchell and other arcade dwellers, with Williams also getting in on the action with the game Defender. Nintendo fancied a slice of this market in the US, with their entrant being the Shigeru Miyamoto-led Donkey Kong, a name which had a convoluted etymological journey from stubborn gorilla, with the funny little Jumpman character featured, with this being recognised as the first platform game. Another notable character developed through Gottlieb, remember the Baffleball people from 1931, later Millstar Electronics, was Cubert in 1982, the orange guy with the funny nose that even got his own cartoon. This 3D looking cube-based pyramid on a 2D surface was influenced by the works of M.C. Escher's Relativity that played around with the laws of gravity. You have to jump on all the squares to change them to the same colour, whilst being chased around by different characters and objects, which gets more and more complicated as you progress. With these emerging character-driven games and the explosion of interest during the so-called golden age of arcade games, the time was right for a watch company to snap up the licenses. It seems Casio didn't jump on this, despite being the leader in the game watch field. Instead, it was Nelsonic, who made the move to agree a license deal with Ballet Midway. Such licensing deals were part of the history of the brand, who had licensed the right to watches for $6 Million Man, amongst others, and the first licensed gaming watch was Pac-Man, complete with mini joystick on one of the variants and pad-like buttons on the other. So cool. Interestingly enough, our friends at Nintendo with their Game & Watch are also attributed with one of the major innovations of the D-pad, with the cross design on the Donkey Kong edition of their Game & Watch range in 1982. Nelsonic carried on its smart licensing into 1983 with Sega and the Frogger license, a game involving you helping a poor frog crossing busy lanes of traffic and riverborne hazards and trying not to get squished. In the same year, Nelsonic also produced the Cubert watch, now infamously worn in Stranger Things by the character Will Byers. You can find this one around in clone formats, relatively typical with the Hong Kong-based suppliers of these modules, of examples like this Clown watch. The slowdown in major licenses from 1983 until 19 1989 aligns with the event often attributed as almost destroying the whole video game industry, funnily enough also a license job, which was the catastrophic failure of the E.T. game in 1983 from Atari, famously sent to landfill by the truckload. Whilst we take a break from the Nelsonic game watches, another company of note is General Consumer Electronics, or GCE, who developed the 1982 Vectrex console that they licensed from Smith Engineering. This included glorious-looking games like the Fortress of Nazrod. We see some cool examples of their handheld game offerings with the likes of this Chase Encounter and Space Encounter game from 1982. As well, in 1982 they would launch the Game Time Watch, developed by the US company Western Technologies with a Japanese chip, the partners being Sharp and Toshiba, and manufactured in Hong Kong. The genesis of the watch was the idea of Jay Smith, the president of Western Technologies, that you could play multiple games on one watch, with the development being driven by Tom Sloper, Jerry Carr, and Gary Nile. The Game Time Watch was the realization of this, complete with 4 different games: Firing Squad, Alien Assault, Missile Strike, and Blast Away. Other watches in the range were the Arcade Time and the Sports Time, designed by Patrick King, with the latter having football, basketball, and soccer games, and the former having Hyperblast, Planet Raiders, Galaxy Gunner, and Cosmic Clash. GCE would be acquired by the board game company Milton Bradley. One of their games was Simon, which was funnily enough also a game watch, and the Vectrex was an unfortunate victim of the 1983 video game crash, with Milton Bradley itself being acquired by Hasbro in 1984, who closed down the GCE division. The other major contributor to gaming watches is of course a channel favourite, and one of the first movers here, which was Casio, who developed at least 40 different titles. Later models closer to the Nelsonic style included the GH17 Space Hero, the GG9 Golf, GF2 Scramble Fighter, all very safe, as well as some more baffling ideas like Tortoise F1 and Egg Panic. Outside of these very similar looking watches, there are also things like the basketball game watch, with slightly different stylings. I would be failing in my coverage of this area if I didn't cover some of the ventures of other major watch brands into the gaming watch area, normally just rebadging on Hong Kong modules used elsewhere. These include Orient, Yema, Kelton and their parent company Timex, as well as Armatron. An interesting watch tech to allude to here is Seiko's wrist computer, the UC2200 and other variants, which I do so because one of these actually came with a game ROM pack which you could load into this slot. After the video game crash of 1983, the company that came to the rescue was obviously Nintendo, first with their own domestic offering with the Famicom, but on North American shores in a rolling manner between 1985 and 1986 with the Nintendo Entertainment System. The games on the NES included that Jumpman guy from Donkey Kong, Mario, followed later by The Legend of Zelda between 1986 and 1987. 2 new mascots, and the broader spike in enthusiasm for games with the release of the Genesis meant new opportunities for licensing deals, so back in jump Nelsonic, Xeon in Europe, to land the deal in 1989 and the introduction of both the Super Mario Bros. Game watch and the Zelda watch under the Nintendo brand, a real coup. As well as continuing the collaboration with Nintendo into Mario 2 with some more inventive spin-offs, and Super Mario 3 in 1990, there would be the link into Nintendo's crazy successful Game Boy game Tetris with the Tetris Game Watch. The relationship would carry over onto Nintendo's new console, the Super Nintendo or SNES, with watches like Super Mario Kart or Race in 1992, Star Fox in 1993, and ultimately back to the source of a lot of this, the Donkey Kong gaming watch in 1994, which coincided with the Donkey Kong Country release from Rareware and its innovative 3D style graphics somehow dragged out of the SNES with what seems to be magic. This was the last of their major releases, and they limped on throughout the 90s, largely replaced by handheld gaming options like the Game Boy and Sega Game Gear. Around the same time as this Nintendo license wave of Nelsonic watches was the first forays of Tiger Electronics, a company founded in 1978 and producers of 80s educational products like the K28 talking learning computer. Their handheld LCD games have become omnipresent with the heavy use of licensing like this 1988 Terminator one. A fun fact is that it was Tiger Electronics' Talkboy that was famously used in Home Alone 2. They made the natural move into the gaming watch domain between 1988 and 1989, with cool examples being this hard driving model based on the Atari arcade game, Castlevania's Simon Quest watch licensed from Konami, Altered Beast licensed from Sega, Double Dragon from Tradewest Inc., and Ninja Gaiden from Tecmo, as well as Mega Man 2 from Capcom. One style that looked a little different from their normal was this Dick Tracy watch, a homage to the watch from the comic books that was a technological target for the industry for many years afterwards, a bit like the Knight Rider watch. These watches started to get very plastic fantastic with the Street Fighter II watch, following the release of that Capcom game, and the revival of the arcade fighting game scene in 1991 with this 1993 watch, complete with bulky Blanka and Guile figures around the outside. A style they continue with movie movie tie-in watches for Aladdin and Jurassic Park. Other examples from the time included TV licenses like The Simpsons, and this kid's Sonic the Hedgehog watch. So 90s. Tiger Electronics would also eventually come under the Hasbro umbrella from 1998, with their first major contribution being the Furby. They did still keep the LCD games going for a while, with 1997's Duke Nukem Grip game being my favourite. There's also some similar watches to the Tiger ones, I presume done under license, sold at Radio Shack. Another toy-based company that had a series of game watches was Tomy. These included the Wrist Bowling game, as well as a series called Watchman with titles including Sudokan, Pro Wrestling, Cat and Catch, Golf 2, Monster Hero, Fishing, and Kurohige, a pirate-themed game. One curiosity I've seen, and I can't tell whether it's Tiger, is this Konami-branded Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles watch. I loved this show as a kid. Now, good old Casio had not quite finished being a major innovator in the gaming watch field, and in 1994 they released the super imaginative JG100 Infraceptor or Infrabeamer Tower Master game watch, sometimes called Super Cybercross. This has 2 games, with the first enabling you, and if you want, a friend, to battle the computer in the Tower Master adventure game with a sword, bow and arrow, and whip. A little bit like rock, paper, scissors, you select your weapon and advance through a 10-floor temple with different bosses to beat at different stages, all the way up to Zex, King of Demons. If you lose, then you go back to jail for an hour, although you can break out if you guess a code. The Magic Beam battle game is more straightforward, and is just you battling against a friend to see who can rack up the most wins, rock, paper, scissors style. The similarly branded JG200 attached a battery-powered module and a different button layout, and the last in the series was a totally mad 1996 JG300 Cybermax Punch and Kick Force measuring game, which also came in this comic book themed iteration. The only inheritor of this lineage that I can see which combines this physical and adventure based element are the Digimon Vital Bracelet from Bandai, which combines fitness tracking with the training and battling of your Digimon, with there also being a Pokemon Go accessory that pairs with your phone when playing the game. I suppose the time seems right to combine augmented reality with a watch based accessory, so let's see if this evolves. The adventure mode stylings of the Casio game are really nice to see, as it ties into that other aspect of video game history, which to this point we haven't really talked about, which is rooted in the text and later visual adventure game as personified in things like the Colossal Cave Adventure, King's Quest, and Sierra Online games. This always reminds me of the apparently made up game in Big called Cavern of the Evil Wizard. A nice, more modern homage to this tradition is the Fossil Wrist PDA, which included the classic text adventure game Colossal Cave Adventure, and you really love to see it. There have been some more modern nods to the gaming watch, like the Tokyo Flash Jackpot watch. I'm not sure if they ever made it, but there have been some submissions to Tokyo Flash for some cool looking gaming watches like this Blocks watch, as well as this Genesis watch. Nixon have also had some prototypes with a game watch theme. Modern gaming in a watch is particularly present within the realm of smartwatches, including things like Pixel Miner on the 2014 Pebble Watch, the suite of Android-based games on Android Wear-enabled watches like the Samsung Galaxy, and of course, the Apple Watch. The tradition of more conventional gaming watches does occasionally pop up with the odd Fossil watch, but they are periodic novelties rather than a sustained line. There was even this Kickstarter for the Atari Game Band, but that isn't the end of our story. The world of gaming-themed collaborations, watches integrated into games, and gaming lifestyle-oriented watches is a large one, and we'll dive into that next. It would be impossible to have a comprehensive covering of the various gaming-themed watches, especially of the massive deluge of cheap promotional watches with favoured characters and games. This Mortal Kombat watch for ages 5 and up amused me. Some smart watches like this Minecraft one, and merch watches that are often of questionable legality. Mario had his fair share of watch-based link-ups, but a couple of more recent ones I'll mention are this G-Shock Square collaboration, and the ongoing Tag Heuer connected watch, which also links over to Mario Kart within their normal mechanical watch line. Alba did a pretty cool analog, as did Wired. The British brand Mr. Jones had made a watch based upon the background of Mario games. Romain Jerome also did a Mario watch, as well as a whole bunch of others, including Pokemon, a Pikachu watch, Space Invaders, Pac-Man, Donkey Kong, and a Tetris watch. Now, Pokemon has so many watches, especially related to Pikachu, so a couple of other examples are this Pikachu Baby G, Fossil, and these Seiko Pokemon watches. Talking of G-Shock, they've also collaborated on this Mother G-Shock, of which the game Earthbound is one of the episodes. Continuing on cult games, here is a Seiko linked into the Chrono Trigger universe, the Chronopolis 2400. I'm going to go subtler with a Sonic watch. How about this Swatch Beat Sonic collaboration? I kind of want one of these. Street Fighter II had many collaboration watches over the years, including the D180 and 181 models from Citizen, but one of the ones hitting headlines for better or worse was the relatively recent Seiko 5 series with automatic watches themed after each of the characters. The battle for the best Pac-Man watch collaboration was also recently fought between Timex and Casio. I got the Timex because I like the alarm. Timex also released a Space Invaders themed watch, as did Casio, so they're going into all the arcade classics. How about this hula hoop design Space Invaders LED watch? Going to a different console, more typically associated with the Neo Geo, is a watch from D1 Milano based on the Metal Slug games. And by the way, this brand are eating up some very interesting licenses. Linked to my favourite game, there was the competition winner only, Final Fantasy VII Chronograph, in both Cloud and Sephiroth iterations, that will set you back 4,000 or so on eBay now. There's also this Seiko Final Fantasy watch. On the PlayStation, there were multiple watches themed around Tomb Raider and Lara Croft, with a notable one being the Timex Grip Clip. An example of in-game was Metal Gear Solid 5, which was a homage to the Bond classic, which is this Seiko Wired Digital worn by Snake. And we continue with these gaming collaborations with the Kojima Astron watch, the makers of Death Stranding and this Monster Hunter watch. Stripping back to basics, there is this Hamilton Far Cry 6 collaboration, which you'd never even know was a gaming watch. Larco have made a watch inspired by the Fallout game series. Both the Call of Duty and Medal of Honor series have multiple in-game watches, with my favourite Omega Seamaster inspired in-game watch being the one used by James Bond in GoldenEye 64. An emerging favourite is the Last of Us watch, which I've seen as a focus on Jenny L's channel of all places. This Tom Clancy Mineseeker watch was another tie-in I found. Halo Infinite was a license snapped up by MSTR watches, with this watch being the result. Bethesda Games have done watches, including this Doom watch, and I've seen people compare the look of the Casio BM200W to Doom Guy's helmet. Adhering to the oft-quoted Doom will run on anything, this remains true in smartwatch land, as it's been run on Android watches. Whilst I'm at it, I've seen the Casio TS200 called the Scorpion from Mortal Kombat, which I think is a great shout. An interesting collaboration was the one between Tag Heuer and Gran Turismo, where they were the official timekeeper within the game from 2017 to 2020. An interesting novelty is watches based upon the shape of the console, which you see for most, including the NES, Game Boy, PlayStation, Sega Saturn, Time Gear, and you also see retro brands like Atari and Namco Bandai doing watches to appeal to this retro aesthetic market. Another curiosity I'll throw in is this modern mechanical gaming watch. Now there's an idea which loops us all the way back to that original Monte Carlo watch. Finally, a trend I've noticed is watches with a gamer aesthetic and branding that don't actually have games or a specific game theme. Some examples here are this Bulliver D-Cave collaboration on the classic Computron. The second is this Razer smartwatch, the guys behind gaming accessories. This FaZe Clan G-Shock links into the competitive gaming scene. Brew watches homages 8-bit style with the Brew Retrograph 8-bit watch. And this fun little Seiko Sega watch that the Cuckoo for Watches channel found. Well, there you are. I bet you never expected there to be so much crossover between video games and watches, right? I know I didn't. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, then you may enjoy a video I made on the digital watch iceberg that digs into some of the more obscure watches from digital watchland. I hope you have a great rest of your day.